So our last step, it looked at the situation up until the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Here is the map of Europe after the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. So the Czech and the Czech lands here, Bohemia, Moravia, have been moved into under outright German control. Slovakia is a German puppet state. Hungary is a German ally. Hitler's next target is Poland, which was a country that recreated after World War I. This Polish corridor, the border between Poland and the Baltic Sea, had a significant German population. Hitler insists, much like the Sudetenland, that it be reacquired. Unlike Czechoslovakia, which had a natural boundary, the Sudetenland is kind of a hilly region. Poland has a long, basically unguarded border with Hitler. The French and British, after the Nazi occupation of rump Czechoslovakia, suddenly reverse themselves 180 degrees and extend guarantees of territorial integrity to Poland, to Romania, and to Yugoslavia. The question is, how can the British really, protect the Poles? The British and French quickly conclude that the best way to do that would be to persuade the Soviet Union to join in a kind of anti-fascist alliance. The Poles are adamantly opposed to this for reasons which are quite understandable. They're worried that if the Soviets send troops to their territory, the Soviets will never pull them out. There had been a bloody war between Poland and the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War I. And this kind of simmers along throughout the summer of 1939, when suddenly in late August, the Nazis and the Soviets announced that they have entered into after secret negotiations, entered into a treaty called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Accord, named for the foreign ministers of the two countries. In public, the Nazi-Soviet pact says that the two sides will be neutral against one another, that they will, that there will be no conflict, and so this basically tells the Poles, you're not going to get the Soviets' aid. In private, the accord calls for the division of Eastern Europe, and under the terms of the accords, all of the territory that is to the east of this blue line, see the blue line here on the map, this is assigned to a Soviet zone. And all of the territory to the west, so Lithuania, half of Poland, the remaining part of Czechoslovakia, is assigned to the German. The Germans. This is a secret codicil. It's not announced publicly. And so the result, here's the situation at, a couple of days before the start of war. By this point, it's clear that that there's going to be war, that it will be Poland and France and Britain against Germany, and eventually probably Italy. The Italians announced that they will not immediately enter the war. So here's the situation strategically at the start of World War II. So Czechoslovakia is no longer present, so they've been eliminated. So we just have the Poles with the French and the British. The German strategy is called Blitzkrieg. They try to launch a massive attack on Poland. The French choose primarily a defensive effort. They, even when Germany invades Poland, the French do not send any. They cross like a mile into German territory, but there's no serious attempt to invade. The Poles are basically left to their fate. This is the start of September 1939. This map. By the end of September 1939, Poland has ceased to exist. As the Polish army and government is besieged by Germans invading from the west, in the middle of September, the Soviets invade Poland from the east, and the Polish state is wiped out by the end of the month. Which leaves Britain and France in Western Europe against Germany in a one-front war, with the Soviet Union neutral, and not only neutral, but actually supplying some assistance to the Germans. Even so, on paper, the British and French are militarily superior at this point. The German army does war games, and they suggest that it's very, very likely the French are going to win the war. They're very afraid of an attack, and the reason for this is that the French have invested in what was then this a high-tech defense system called the Maginot Line. These underground railroads that fortify the border between Germany and France. Now, there are weaker defenses here on the Belgian-French border, but the French assume that Belgium, once the war begins, that Belgium, which is still neutral at this point, will remember what happened in World War I and will invite France in. And this is, at the end of the day, this is a safe assumption. Now, if you look really closely here at the map, you'll see that there's a small portion of the German-French border which is not heavily fortified, and also the Luxembourg France border is not heavily fortified. And the reason this isn't heavily fortified is that this area of France is it's believed naturally protected. This is the Ardennes forest, and the sense is that Germany will not be able to get tanks that will come through the Ardennes. So the French approach is, we'll have the Maginot Line. The Ardennes is a kind of natural protection, and we'll focus our efforts on on meeting the enemy in Belgium. The assumption is that, as in World War I, Germany will invade through Belgium. This man here on the right is the French military commander in the run up to the fighting in France. His name is Maurice Gamelin, very conservative, very traditional general. So all of the French assumption is that the Germans are going to attack through Belgium, sort of a version of the Schlieffen Plan. Remember in World War I. The French, the idea with the French, remember what happened to the French? Their territory is occupied during a lot of World War I. So the French military strategy is to rush their troops into Belgium, meet the Germans in Belgium, and then the thinking is that most of the fighting here will occur in Belgian territory rather than in French territory. And if the Germans had moved through Belgium, the French response was just the perfect one. But the Germans come up with a surprise plan. They sort of fake a major invasion of Belgium and instead plan to focus the bulk of their forces through Luxembourg and far southern Belgium through the Ardennes forest. And the hope is to rush their troops to the sea, you can see here on the arrow, and trap the French invasion force in Belgium, separate it from the remainder of the French army here around Paris. Now, what Hitler assumes, and this is an idea that Hitler embraces, and in this, he's turned out correct. What Hitler assumes is that Gamelin and the French leadership as a whole, that the army is so bureaucratized that they won't be able to figure out what's going on quickly enough, and that they won't be able to adjust. Because the danger of this military plan by the Germans is that if the French figure out what's going on and quickly reverse their invading force to attack the German invading force from the north, get more French troops here from the south, the Germans could be held in a sort of pincer. So this is a risky thing. Germany has to be able to break through the lines very quickly. If they're not able to do so, their Western army is likely to be wiped out entirely. The Second World War would have ended in 1940, and we would all be talking about what extraordinary military geniuses the French were. None of us talk about what extraordinary military geniuses the French are. Again, we know what happens. The Germans launched their surprise attack. The French have not only do they not have the Maginot Line protecting the Ardennes, they have a very, very weak military force in the Ardennes, mostly reservists, a lot of people who are in their 40s, you have summoned back to war. The best of the French troops are here on the Belgian Atlantic border to implement the rush into Belgium. The Germans break through the Ardennes. It takes a few days for the French to figure out what's going on. Gamelin issues the order to turn around. By this point, the roads in Belgium are unpassable because there are refugees trying to escape the Nazis coming in. The French government then fires Gamelin. They bring in a new commanding general. They completely rethink their philosophy as this invasion is going on, and the Germans keep just sort of moving forward. Eventually, they cut off the French military in Belgium against supply forces, and within 2 months of the occupation of the intervention, they have driven the combined French and English forces to a tiny portion here on the English Channel, anchored in Dunkirk. And at this point, incredibly, Hitler orders the Germans to stop. And he does so because he's convinced that there's no way that this invasion could be so easy. You know, the French basically offered no resistance. So he figures it has to be a trap, that the British and the Germans have, actually the British and the French have to be planning some kind of counterattack. They're not. They're just sort of desperate. But this gives a sufficient degree of time to the new British government. Chamberlain has finally been deposed, and he's been replaced by Winston Churchill, to organize a mass escape, a rescue effort from Dunkirk. And basically all of the British Expeditionary Force and a significant component of French forces are able to flee, although they have to leave behind their military equipment. So it's a successful rescue in one respect, but it's an overwhelming defeat. There is no significant military presence remaining in France, and the French ultimately surrender. The country is divided into two. There's a puppet state in the south, and a military occupation in the north. So by the time we get to the summer of 1940, it is just Britain against Germany, Britain with no allies left.